everybody. My name is Holsinger-Friesen. I teach here in the theology department, and appreciate you all coming out. I want to just announce that following this session at 2:15 in Ralph Carey Forum, we have Dr. Baycoat for another session, keynote address. And if you were in chapel this morning, you got to hear him. I really enjoyed that. He has a way of making some dense theology really clear and concise. So at any rate, I hope that you can attend at 2:15 in Ralph Carey Forum. So today I'd like to talk about America the Beautiful, Israel the Great. It does bring together two topics that are combustible and dangerous for me. I remember when Dr. Baycoat said, we're sometimes afraid of talking about religion and politics around the Thanksgiving table and, family situations. It's dangerous. And it can be dangerous in my house with my parents and in-laws, there's no doubt. But I don't know, I can't help myself. It's a weakness. I studied theology and have always been interested in politics ever since my undergrad days. So what I'd like to do is kind of just throw some ideas out there to you. I teach a class this semester on the Old Testament prophets, and we're currently in the book of Amos. And so maybe we can look at our contemporary situation today, specifically the rise of nationalism, and then look alongside the book of Amos and any insight or connections that we might see there. So, when some years back we had a president of Spring Arbor who had an inaugural address on globalization through the eyes of faith. And wow, that seems like a long time ago, because now instead of hearing kind of this optimistic view of how globalism is tying us together and isn't this wonderful and the opportunities, now we have a time where we get some retrenchment, I think, and in politics, and it's not just in America, but in Europe and other nations too, nationalism. And I was looking for pictures on Brexit and Trump, and I apologize for this. This is not probably a picture he would want to show, and I don't want to be unfair to him. But Brexit refers to the fact that the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. There is ongoing fragmentation. Some of these transnational organizations, like the UN, like the EU, even NATO, are not as strong as they were, as individual nations wonder about, is this great project worth my time? So certainly we had a major shift in our own country with Donald Trump's election in 2016, but we can look at Hungary, Poland, Turkey as examples where more of a center-right or government is embracing more of a view of, let's look after our own country first. Russia, in the ashes of the crumble of the Soviet Union, they've come back on the world stage, not so much to have this kind of ideological based empire like the Soviet Union, but nationalistic. Russia first. And so maybe we'll talk just a little bit about what we mean by nationalism. Here's President Trump's inauguration. I put 18. I should put 17 there. But at any rate, he says, "At the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. From this day forward, it's going to be America first, America first." I found it interesting that if you go back in history, Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, during a time when there was certainly a threat to our nation, look at his words. These are put together from two of his inaugural addresses. "We have learned that we cannot live alone, at peace, that our own well-being is dependent on the well-being of other nations far away. We have learned that we must live as men, not as ostriches, nor as dogs in the manger. We have learned to be citizens of the world, members of the human community. So, before we might unpack pros and cons of these, it's just worth noting the contrast between FDR's perspective, the place of the United States vis-a-vis the world, and our current president, Donald Trump. So, what is nationalism? Well, some basic definitions. Britannica says it's an ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation-state surpass other individual or group interests. So it's not just we want to focus on Americans. We don't want to send maybe troops overseas or send foreign aid. We want to focus on the poor in our country, whatever. But it also wants to say these individual groups in our country, instead of dealing with this particular social class or this minority, let's focus on what binds us together. Let's energize ourselves, come to a common purpose. Now, in an extreme form, nationalism is especially marked by a feeling of superiority over other countries. And I think we do pick up those themes, or we have, in the last number of years, a focus on let's restore America, make America great. We're number one. But is this a problem? It's interesting that just in the last 2 weeks, there have been a couple of more high-profile news articles on the part of left-leaning journalists who are questioning. Here's one from the Washington Post, whose little slogan, "Democracy dies in the darkness." So you can see that they're suspicious of current trends. But they have this article, "Nationalism can have its good points." Really? Or from Vox, "The left shouldn't fear nationalism, it should embrace it." So even if we do hear from a number of circles, whether secular or Christian, that we've got to beware of nationalism, Trump is leading us down the wrong path, let's at least look at possible pros, advantages, good things. So these articles point to a few bright spots. All of us as human beings do have a basic psychological need to belong. And so understanding our identity as Americans, or any Canadians in the house here, I always want to check that we're fair to the Canadians. Okay, so we do have that need to belong, to understand ourselves in light of, there's a place for me in the world. Demonstrates care and concern for our own communities. And this is maybe something that you've heard, an objection, or maybe felt this way, that, it's all great that we have mission trips and go overseas and help other people, but, you could go into inner city Jackson and there are a lot of struggling people. Let's not forget them. Could it be that nationalism could help focus greater attention on social needs, promote the well-being of citizens? So instead of appealing to these abstract notions of justice or focusing on individual groups of people, let's focus on who we are as Americans. We're Americans, we look out for each other, we take care of each other. And this is interesting, I thought. So you remember when the Trump administration put forward a proposal to limit or ban immigration from certain Muslim majority nations, a few social scientists, Collingwood, Lavarty, and Oskui, did a study where they found out that the more that they primed American identity, this shifted citizens' opinions toward more inclusive rather than restrictive immigration-related policy stances. In other words, how do you feel about banning Muslims from entering our country? Well, people might have an initial thought about that, but when you talk about your identity as Americans and these are the ideals that we stand for, more of these participants ended up kind of coming to the opposite conclusion that, well, because we're Americans, we should have our arms open to folks from other countries who want to come in. After all, we're Americans. We don't focus on exclusion. All right, but maybe one way to look at nationalism, and specifically Christian nationalism, is to watch just a little bit of a video clip. This was a Faith and Freedom event in the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. last year, just before the 4th of July. So here's Dr. Robert Jeffers. He's the pastor of First Baptist in Dallas, and he's with the president. Certainly has been a champion of President Trump. And let's take a look at an interesting juxtaposition of themes here. Okay, so what we have here is a church choir. First Baptist has come up. They also invited other church choirs to join them. And it's a time to celebrate veterans and focus on, how grateful we are as Americans, and I certainly agree with that. What we have here are Christian hymns, church choir. After this song, they'll have the Battle Hymn of the Republic and some remarks. And maybe one thing that I found at least interesting, notable, is that the anthem that they just sung, Make America Great Again, was specifically commissioned by the music leader at the Baptist church here in honor of this particular celebration. Now, there are all sorts of patriotic songs that have Christian themes, but this was Donald Trump's campaign slogan, Make America Great Again. And so coming right on the heels of there's power in the name of Jesus, you see, well, I don't know. What do you see? Is it a wonderful diversity of perspective, a blend, a jarring shift? I guess that's open to interpretation. But here I'll just play a little bit more from the event organizers.
Absolutely, and it is absolutely an indisputable fact that our nation was founded on a love for God and a reverence for His Word. And because of that, we have experienced the undeserved favor of God upon our country. But it is also an indisputable fact that in recent years there have been those who have tried to separate our nation from its spiritual foundation. And that reality has caused many of us, many Christians, to despair and to wonder, is God finished with America? Are our best days over? Has God removed His hand of blessing from us? But in the midst of that despair came November the 8th, 2016. And that day represented the greatest political upset in American history. Because it was on that day, November 8th, that God declared that the people, not the pollsters, were going to choose the next president of the United States. And they chose Donald Trump. You know this, you've heard it often. President Trump won the evangelical vote by the largest margin in history because Christians...
Listen, I guess it's time for an ad, so I guess I'll stop. Okay. Well, I have a mathematical formula here, and this is totally tacky. I apologize for it even before I put it on the screen. This I say is what happens when you stay up too late. But can you solve for this one? N plus R equals. I'd like to suggest that N, nationalism, and R, religion, suggest, I don't feel like the speaker this morning said, it's not a matter of patriotism and religion necessarily having an issue, but nationalism is something maybe even, patriotism multiplied by 1,000, that certainly can become idolatry. So what if nationalism, a belief that, we're number one, God has chosen us to perform a certain task for the world, and that gets mixed with religion. I think then you have the fire of nationalism plus the gasoline of religion and religious language, and then you have a lot of power. And for politicians, power is enticing. Power is effective. So with religious language, I think things can be painted in extreme black and white terms. We can talk about eternal destiny, heaven and hell. Religion, I think, can be the best thing in the world and the worst thing in the world. But what are the motivations for using religious language? So, Christian nationalism, there's a book by Michelle Goldberg on this subject. And she's skeptical for sure about this notion. She says, Christians believe they have a, quote, God-given right to rule. The descriptor refers to so-called dominion theology that harps on a Genesis passage in which Adam and Eve are commanded by God to have dominion over the earth. To those who ascribe to this theology, in whole or in part, Christians must take up this charge, even in the political realm, meaning that America should be ruled by, or even exclusively made up of, conservative Christians. Jeff Shartlett says, what a secular left critic might describe as some kind of imperialism, a Christian nationalist might describe as God's will. So we have heard a fair amount from certain Christian leaders that this is God's will, that Donald Trump be elected. This has spared us from going down to this path of destruction. And it's fair to say, I think from my standpoint, it's a hypothesis. I think it's certainly biblical to believe that God is sovereign and is omnipotent. But sometimes a lack of maybe humility. Do we know what God is up to? In part, but not fully. Lacking humility can bring on some dangerous consequences. We did a little study on dominionist theology, and we might kind of compare it to an ancient Israel standpoint where this conclusion, we're uniquely God's. We're God's chosen people, therefore God is on our side, and that means God is against our enemies. And Lance Wallnau is one of the chief proponents of dominionist theology, and back in 2015, he had a meeting with Donald Trump at Trump Tower, and he felt impressed by God to get his Bible and open to Isaiah 45. There we have a prophecy of King Cyrus, who is a Gentile, who will be instrumental in bringing salvation to God's people. And then he started thinking, 45, who's the 45th president? Well, the one who would soon be elected the following year. So from Wallnau's standpoint, God is showing favor to Donald Trump, raising up not a particularly religious person, but bringing him on the scenes like Cyrus in order to help us fulfill the Great Commission. If you look at the end of Matthew, the Great Commission, Jesus says, go make disciples of all the nations. And so Wallnau takes that literally. He says we're too focused on saving individual souls. We need to focus on discipling the nations. And so he suggests that when America goes down, Christianity goes under siege globally. And so the task for a dominionist is to look at these 7, what he calls mind molders of culture, or mountains. Church, family, education, government, media, art and entertainment, business, and consider the fact that each of those needs to be claimed for God, that Satan has planted people there, and that the church is called to wage spiritual warfare and to occupy these 7 mountains. So from Wallnau's standpoint, Trump is coming in as a wrecking ball. He says he has no commitment but the best interests of the country itself. So Trump has an anointing, and there have been numerous other conferences and rallies. I just invite you to kind of take a look at some of the language here. Here's a Faith and Freedom conference from last year. Because if a political ideology can be put into a religious narrative, I think it energizes that. It energizes people. So Father Paul Grant, at this conference where President Trump spoke, says, we are being discriminated against. There is an anti-Christian movement in the culture. The devil is using his tools to keep us out of the public square. Another quote here from Steve Scheffler from the Faith and Freedom Coalition in Iowa. Religion has been under siege for a long time, and I don't want to sound like an alarmist, but if Hillary Clinton had won, religious liberty in America would basically be finished because of her appointments to the courts. Ralph Reed, who was instrumental in getting kind of the religious right energized under Pat Robertson, he says, Jimmy Carter, a Christian, a Democrat, sat in the pew with us, but he never fought for us. Donald Trump fights, and he fights for us. So it is fairly strong language. Here's a quote to consider, and just kind of pay attention to the way it's phrased. The church's interests cannot fail to coincide with ours alike in our fight against the symptoms of degeneracy in the world of today, against an atheistic movement, against criminality, and in our struggle for the consciousness of a community in our national life. These interests are not anti-Christian, they are Christian principles. All right, so now I have to be really careful because I'm not meaning at all to make any kind of direct comparison between individuals, but I want to look at the language itself. I don't know if you recognize that quote, but it's from Adolf Hitler in 1934. He goes on to talk about this narrative from his standpoint, the German people's standpoint. At least this is the narrative he's painting. We've experienced a miracle, something unique. God first allowed our people to be victorious, then he abased us, laid upon us a period of shamelessness, but now, after struggle, he's permitted us to bring that period to a close. It's a miracle which has been wrought upon the German people. It shows that the Almighty has not deserted our people. I hear that phrase also in Pastor Jeffers. Trump's election shows that God has not deserted us. He received it into favor at the moment when it rediscovered itself. Our vow, so long as we shall live, so long as the Lord gives us the strength to carry on the fight. So a lot of martial language, fighting, battle, struggle. And like I said, please don't hear me, I'm not equating Trump with Hitler. They're vastly different. But I want us, instead of focusing on the individuals, to focus on what these words kind of imply about power and imply about this narrative. So, Reverend Richard Lee in his benediction at this conference said, Father, we pray for our president today. Thank you, Lord, that you've given us a man who will stand for right, a man who will stand for truth. Father, he is under attack, which is to be expected. So, taken to its extreme, and this is not where we are as a nation, but taken to an extreme, fascism has a mobilizing vision, according to Roger Griffith. A national community rising phoenix-like after a period of encroaching decadence, which all but destroyed it. So this mythical bird who periodically is reduced to ashes but then is reborn. It's a compelling narrative. Is it true? Well, I mean, I don't know that any of us can say absolutely yes or no, but we should judge these ideas by their fruits and consider Scripture, which we'll get to. Tony Perkins from the Family Research Council, responding to this charge that Trump had an affair with an adult film star and paid her $130,000 to stay quiet about it. Perkins said, I would not say it's not a problem. Again, this election, evangelicals did not vote for Donald Trump based on his moral qualifications, but based upon what he said he was going to do and who he surrounded himself with. We kind of gave him, all right, you get a mulligan, you get a do-over here. And Jerry Falwell Jr. would talk about, we're a people of forgiveness as Christians, which absolutely we need to be. In 2009, Tony Perkins, same man, was interviewed when a Congressman, John Ensign, was caught having an affair. He said, if you're going to champion those issues, family values, you've got to live by a higher standard. I think all public servants should be faithful to their vows of marriage. I can't imagine why voters would think politicians would be faithful to them if they're not faithful to their spouse. So journalists like to have their gotcha moments, and so it was brought up in this interview with Politico. Oh, well, aren't you being hypocritical here? And by being so harsh against adultery, but now kind of overlooking, we're going to give Trump a mulligan. And he says, why should I not support Trump now, when he's actually doing the things I asked him to do? Well, what changed? There's a lot that's changed over the last number of years, but I think most obviously the evangelical right, or a majority of them, if 81% of white evangelicals support Trump, now have a certain amount of power and influence that they didn't have or didn't feel like they had under Obama, or maybe even ever before. So, power. Now, I had a professor in seminary. His name was Bob Lyon, and he was kind of a quirky, wonderful man, but people didn't like him very much because they thought he was grumpy. Asbury Seminary was given an $80 million gift. That's a lot of money. What could you do with 80 million? I mean, what would Spring Arbor do with a nice 80? But my professor, and this was shortly before I got there, posted a little thing on his office door, something to the effect of, this money is going to be the ruin of us, and and stuff. So he was not that popular. But he said one thing to me that has really stuck with me. And he said two things about power. And he was a pacifist. He said, never seek power and always fear power. Never seek power and always fear power. Now, I think it'd be easy to say, and maybe I think this too, is that just too idealistic? Because all of us have power in some way. Getting a college degree gives you a true degree of power vis-a-vis other people in the job market and so forth. But this notion of not seeking power, it's like the adage about church bishops. The ones that are really clamoring to get a job are exactly the ones you don't want to have that job. So power, to some extent, is inevitable. It's a part of human life. We use power to get things done. But I think when we look at Jesus' life, he did not use power in the way that would have been expected of a great religious or even political leader. And so I agree with my professor that power is dangerous. I want to have my eyes wide open. Nationalism and power. So, how is power viewed, garnered, employed? I'm not a political scientist, but I would throw out some tentative thoughts here that from a nationalist perspective, we have this nation that can be a well-oiled machine. We can amplify the power residing in individuals and groups if we're all rowing the same direction. So we've got to align all the cogs in this machine because then we can have maximum impact. So some of the assumptions there, power, the exercise of power to gain national prestige or riches or project strength, this is a good thing, and that individuals, local governments should be willing to hand over their power for the best interests of the state. This is very abstract, and I think if we do a review of history, human history, it's all too often that when we have this abstract notion of do the best thing for the state or do the right thing, that often it's doing the best thing for the leader of that country, because that leader may know how to manipulate people. So what kind of a society does it yield? Well, dissent isn't really tolerated. I mean, I shouldn't say tolerated. It's not viewed as a positive thing. You don't really want the news media speaking negatively if you've got a great nationalistic project, because this throws up obstacles. It slows down the efficiency of this machine. President Trump says we're going to have an all-new nuclear force, and it's going to be the greatest, ever. Think about some of these checks that countries have, especially democracies, to rein in some of the extreme uses of power. What about the judiciary? Well, I think we see that our president doesn't have a real high view of the judicial system when it seems to impede the policy that he wants to bring across, whether it's on immigration or banning certain travelers or whatever. Nationalism, to focus its energy, really needs to have some sort of enemy. Now, I'm old enough to remember the Soviet Union and at Tiananmen Square in China. This revolution happened the day that I was graduating from high school, 1989. And I remember watching the TV in my parents' bedroom, and I'm straightening my tie out, getting ready to go, and they're showing images of Tiananmen Square. So communism is falling, it looks like. Certainly there were radical changes. The Soviet Union crumbles. But for the time that America was that one superpower without any external enemy, I think we were, I don't know, not terribly motivated. It's hard to all row together when we don't have a common objective or common enemy. So it didn't take long before Islamic extremists and ISIS and Al-Qaeda then took, to some extent, communism's place as the focus of our attention in terms of resisting. I do think that emotion is something powerful that a politician can tap into for nationalistic purposes. We see that in history. But efficiency is so often this goal. How do we remove roadblocks to decisive action? What's best for America as a whole? Speaking of power, here's a quote from President Trump. Maybe you've heard it. When you're speaking to a bunch of police officers in New York, when you see thugs being thrown into the back of a paddy wagon, you just see them thrown in, rough. I said, please don't be too nice. Like when you guys put someone in the car and you're protecting their head, you know, you put your head over it. Like, don't hit their head and they've just killed somebody. I said, you can take the hand away, okay? And there's this pause in the clip, and then there's kind of some nervous laughter. But what do we think about accused criminals? Do they have any rights to be considered? That if they did, that would throw some resistance into this well-oiled machine of wanting to discern who's on the right side, who's on the wrong side, and how do we get order out of chaos. On this issue of police treatment of suspects, this is from a study in 2015, the American Value Study, that there is a massive divide between white evangelical Protestants and African Americans, or black Protestants here, on this issue of whether police mistreatment of suspects, these are isolated incidents or part of a broader pattern. I mean, look at this. 72% of white mainline Protestants or evangelicals think that these are isolated incidents. 82% of black Protestants think it's part of a broader problem. And we're all Christians. This is noteworthy, at least. Why this disparity? And could our view of God have something to do with it? I do think, even though we were made in the image of God, and God tells us not to make images of Him, it is partly human nature to want to make God in our image. If we are the powerful, God is on the side of power. If we're the weak, God is on the side of the vulnerable. If you've been in my class before, you may have seen this, but this is a picture of a cloud a few years back off the coast of Portugal. And it was named the Fist of God. And it's a pretty cool picture. But what does it reveal? If we see in that cloud a fist, we emphasize God's power and the absoluteness of moral judgment, right from wrong. In that line, I would suspect, some of these numbers are not entirely surprising from the Pew Research Center. That when asked this question, how often can torture be used against suspected terrorists? The percentage that say it can most often be justified white evangelical Protestants argue that more than any other group. And in fact, on this scale here, the more frequently people go to church, the more likely they are to support this sort of use of torture against suspected terrorists. Those who are unaffiliated with religion seem quite reticent to inflict torture or have that as a possibility. It's troubling. I find it troubling, puzzling, but I wonder if it makes sense in the broad scheme of things if we think that God is primarily a God of law and order. Rewarding the faithful, punishing the evildoers. And if God is like that and we're God's people, then we're justified in punishing evildoers, even if it includes something like torture. Donald Trump, I'm in total support of waterboarding. It has to be within the law, but I have to expand the law. Jesus' words there. I think I'm going to skip some of this, but this notion of our Lord being a fighter and how when there's a battle going on, we can justify all sorts of things. We can close our eyes to the needs of outsiders, whether they are people in Haiti or the outsiders within our country, immigrants, and whether we view them as evildoers. On this issue of kneeling for the anthem, it reminded me of our son Samuel. He was probably, maybe 7, 8 years old. And at the time we were going to St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Jackson. And as you go in, there is a little basin of holy water, and some people choose to scoop some water and put the sign of the cross on their forehead as a reminder of their baptism. So it's just a call to remember our baptism. And Mary Campbell, Chuck and Mary used to be professors here. They were visiting that day, and so they're following Samuel, and Samuel's doing this, and Mary says, now what is that all about? What are you doing here? And Samuel says, I don't know, we just do it. And it cracked me up. So we just stand up and honor the flag. Well, maybe we should. I do believe we should love our country. I do believe in patriotism. And if honoring the flag is appropriate, saying the pledge, by all means, yes. But do we ever question that, or do we just do it? And if people are not just doing it, are they somehow the enemy? I think it's possible to view people who question the status quo as somehow a threat. And I guess they are a threat because they're calling into question some of these assumptions that we have. Was Israel in the 8th century nationalist? Strictly speaking, no. Nationalism is a modern phenomenon, but I think we should look at how power is described in this book of the prophets. How are the powerless viewed and treated? In a general sense, the prophets are going to look and argue, like Gordon McConville says, the impossibility of being truly Israel in the absence of a love of righteousness and justice. Israel's boundaries are put into question. The remnant is going to be true Israel. And at the same time, there's a narrowing of the people of God. There's also a broadening, where the covenant applies now to all, or is open to all nations. God desires to bring them all, and He is sovereign over all creation. Some of the rhetoric of Amos is very strong. Beginning of the book. The Lord roars from Zion. The Lord is a lion here. Utters His voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds wither, and the top of Carmel, this most lush part of Israel, dries up. So note here how when the Lord speaks, when the Lord acts, the land responds. But as we will see, the prophet says the people of God are not responding. So this word to individuals, cows of Bashan, he calls these particular women who oppress the poor, crush the needy, say to their husbands, bring something to drink. The Lord God has sworn by his holiness, the time is surely coming upon you when they will take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks. We do see some common ground between 8th century Israel and 21st century America. Now, I've never heard of this prosperity meal or the prosperity McFizz, but beef prosperity yogurt. But I don't know, maybe it was another country. But if we look at the reign of King Jeroboam during the time of Amos, we see that this is one of those rare opportunities where Israel, the northern kingdom, is really flourishing, because the nations around Assyria, being the big power, is in decline. You have, as the big guy is struggling with his own issues, and Egypt is fairly quiet, then you have these smaller nations kind of coming to life and expanding. We think that King Jeroboam presided over a very a prosperous time, at least for the elites in Israel. The borders were expanded, trade was flourishing with other nations, and we get all sorts of clues from the text itself. There are summer and winter houses, people lying on couches with these fancy pillows, Amos will say. People just hanging out, sitting around drinking wine. When Amos comes to speak, he starts off in a way that the people of his day would have loved, because he brings these words from God against Israel's enemies. So, the word from the Lord here: for 3 transgressions of Damascus and for 4 I will not revoke the punishment, because they have threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. So I will send a fire on the house of Hazael, the king there, devour the strongholds. This goes on and on. Basically, all of the nations surrounding Israel are going to be judged. Philistia, Moab, Edom, Ammon, the Arameans, Tyre. And so if you're Israel, you're feeling pretty good about this. Now this guy, Amos, he was a southerner, and so maybe there was a little suspicion there at first, but now he's talking about how God is going to judge your enemies and burn their strongholds to the ground. Go get them, God. And God judges the nations because he is making clear the reality that he is Lord of all. He's not just Israel's little nationalist God, but he has a claim over all nations. Now, the real surprise comes when we read a little bit later and discover that Amos is going to point his finger at Judah first, which is the little brother to Israel, and then at Israel itself. God says, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment. Because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, they who trample the head of the poor in the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and son go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. And they, in the house of their God, they drink wine bought with fines they imposed. I'd like to suggest that, well, sin is always horrible, but the kind of sin that the prophet describes here with Israel and the other nations, it's instrumental sin in the sense that you have nations. Here's the Ammonites. They are ripping over pregnant women in Gilead in order to enlarge their territory. The leaders in Moab have burned to lime the bones of the king of Edom, which would have been a horrible, the awful, most awful thing in the world to have your corpse desecrated and the bones scattered. Why are they burning the bones of the king of Edom? Because they're getting lime from these bones, and they're using the lime to plaster houses, luxury houses. So see that instrumental nature of sin. And then with Israel, they are laying down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. A little bit here. According to Exodus, if you lend money to my people, you shall not exact interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as collateral, you restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. And what else should this person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. So, this is a time in Israel where religiously things are going great. They're having their festivals, they're worshiping the Lord, but they're ignoring the cries of the needy. In fact, the concentration of power is flowing towards the monarch and towards the rich elite, and I'll show you why in just a minute. Social injustice in Amos is tied to the treatment of the land and its farmers, at least according to Ellen Davis. There have been a number of archaeological discoveries and even texts that would suggest during this time period in Amos's day, we have the development of a centralized system of commodity agriculture controlled by the crown. So instead of having subsistence farmers, each having a little plot that they're eking out in existence, now you have the monarch seizing control of large tracts of land and putting them under the control of either the state or of these elites. And they're using these lands to grow products for export. So wine, wheat, this kind of thing is going on around the world today, even. One example would be in Indonesia, Ethiopia, other places where palm oil plantations are being used, and they're clear-cutting the forest, displacing local people, all in the interests of maybe the nation as a whole to gain greater commerce or the interests of the leader. But these little jar handles have been unearthed. In fact, tons of them around strongholds, or let's see if I can find this. Regional storehouses have been uncovered. Over 1,000 jar handles have been discovered that have the inscription belonging to the king. Now, God's judgment against these strongholds that's outlined by Amos may refer to not just military fortresses, but also these granaries and other types of, emblems of strength. Your word for today is latifundalization, the word that means making wide estates, where the crown is taking land from indebted freeholders and giving it to a new aristocracy. So, all that to say is, it seems like in Amos's day, the power differential between the top and the bottom is really widening, and the people are maybe fulfilling their obligation to provide the sacrifices to God, to follow the festivals, but when it comes to loving their neighbor, clearly things are going in the opposite direction. You're familiar with Jesus' words in Matthew 22 about, what's the greatest commandment in the law? He says, love your neighbor as yourself, as well as loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And this is found in the Old Testament, Leviticus 19, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Deuteronomy 6:5, love the Lord your God with your all. I found this interesting from the Babylonian Talmud in Judaism. This would have been after the time of Christ. But you ever wonder, what does it mean to love God? Does it mean to go to church a lot? Does it mean to read your Bible every day or pray extra hard? Maybe. But I think we would probably want to admit that it's easier to conceptualize what it means to love another person. Sometime today I got to run out and get flowers for my wife. But tangible things. All I have to say is, how do you love a being who's invisible, who's God? So these two commands, Jesus says, are linked: loving God and loving neighbor. And one possible way to look at it, according to these rabbis, to love God means that the name of heaven is beloved because of you. In other words, by the way you live your life, the rest of the world sees you and says, wow, their God is great. Or what a merciful, loving God. I'm not saying that exhausts the meaning of loving God, but I think it's an interesting way to look at it, because there it doesn't pit loving God and loving neighbor as like, okay, I've got to choose which one, or how do these two go together? Maybe loving neighbor is a way of loving God. At the very least, these are intricately intertwined, and it just simply won't do to perform our religious duties and feel like as long as we're loving God that way, that loving neighbor can come second. In fact, there's a provocative book written by a rabbi. His name is Daniel Hartman. The title is called Putting God Second. And he makes this kind of controversial argument that the way we love God is by loving other people. And that's what God would have us do. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that in our day and age, just like in every day and age, we've got to be wary of manipulating God, or presuming to manipulate God. Here's Hartman. He says, when religion is doing its job, it fills the role of moral mentor, reminding, cajoling, exhorting, and at times threatening its adherents to check their self-interest and become people who see others, who cannot remain indifferent, who define their religious identities as agents of moral good. But for a religion to fulfill this task, it must redefine both the concept and the role of God, and thus the susceptibility of its adherents to manipulate God in ways that eschew moral standards in favor of self-interest. Only when religion lives up to the standards of the good and the reasonable that stand outside of it do we sanctify God's name and avoid its desecration. So, I don't know. If you buy this is just a hypothesis, then if secularists are looking at evangelical Christians and saying, wow, you guys support torture? That's kind of surprising. I thought Jesus was loving. And we say, well, we believe in right and wrong, and we believe evildoers should be punished. If that's offensive to an outsider, to where they feel like we're violating some standard of morality, some universal standard, at the very least we should think about that. Consider it. We don't have the luxury of just saying, well, we're moral according to our own internal standards, and we don't really care what the world says or thinks. So to close here, nationalism kind of goes back to Genesis. Cain asking God, am I my brother's keeper? And then, assuming the answer is yes, which it is, who is my brother? Who is my neighbor? You know, based on the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke, that our neighbors are not just those like us, Haitians, Indonesians, Muslims, Christians, people in inner city Jackson. These are our neighbors. And I like to think that even if I have trouble with that, what about Al-Qaeda? What about this and that? What if they truly are our enemy? Doesn't Jesus call us then to love our enemies? So it really doesn't change anything. So this question, does nationalism help me to fulfill that mandate, to be my brother's keeper in a broad sense? Last slide here, Amos 9. The Lord, the God of hosts, who calls for the water of the sea and pours them out on the surface of the earth. So a magnificent, majestic God of all the world, God of creation. The Lord is his name, and he asks Israel, his chosen people, are you not like the Ethiopians to me? O people of Israel, says the Lord, did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Captor, and the Arameans from Kir? I mean, it's a rhetorical question here, but the implication is kind of powerful. God's not saying that he is rejecting his people, but he's relativizing their claim that God is only their God. I think nationalism has a problem with statements like this. Christian nationalism especially. It does call for true humility. So thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.